to. I have only a very short thing to read. Unaccustomed as I am to doing this recently. But anyway, let me simply say it's just a joy to be here and to see faces coming up on the screen, old colleagues, maybe, and new colleagues I can see. Look so much forward to meeting everybody and seeing more of our fabulous students. But it's great to see Brett and others here. It's a pleasure to be associated with this event, which attempts in part, only in part because we can't possibly do it actually full enough, the contribution that Mark has made to the Department of Global Studies and the field of global studies itself since the beginning. Two of us, already retired, Rich Applebaum and I, were with him in this endeavor pretty much, that is the beginning of global studies at Santa Barbara, from the start. In fact, when we learned about Mark's title for this talk, Rich wondered if we were the three tensions in global studies that Mark was going to discuss today. But the building of the program would have gone nowhere if we three had not been joined almost immediately by an absolutely remarkable group of scholars and then students. Both undergraduate and graduate, who have over the years made their own extraordinarily significant contributions to the build out of the field. Still, Mark's input has been in its way utterly unique and truly indispensable, not least because of the public intellectual presence he established internationally from the beginning, at least from our beginning. Not only through his writing, that includes, as we all now know, some 30 volumes in all, including the prize-winning Terror in the Mind of God, the global rise of religious violence, and also through his organization of such institutions as the Orfalea Center for Global Studies, and the creation of the Consortium of Global Studies programs throughout the world, and his editing of the 4-volume Encyclopedia of Global Studies, but also by his public speaking in this country and abroad, which literally kept him for years lecturing at least once every 2 weeks somewhere else on planet Earth. In all these ways and more, he has helped extend the presence of global studies and the work of this department worldwide. But like the development of anything this creative, there have been, to go back to Mark's title this noon, tensions, one hopes, that have been mostly productive. In any case, let's see what Mark has to say. And then, in the conversation to follow between you and him, what you specifically make of them. I'm here simply to moderate, and now it's time for Mark.
Well, thank you, Giles. It's a wonderful introduction. A wonderful introduction in a couple ways. One is I'm flattered at what you said, of course, but also you set us up for the conversation that I hope will soon ensue. Because what I'd like to do is make some remarks and then go to conversation that I think initially would be appropriate with you and Rich, since you're both here, and you'll have something I'm sure to add to what I've said. But then engage all of us, because I want to talk not just about the past, but more importantly about the future, where the field of global studies is going. And these remarks are based in part by comments that I wrote in this book. This is a cheap advertisement, by the way, for the book, the Oxford Handbook of Global Studies, that Manfred Steger and Saskia Sasson and I co-edited. And when we were trying to figure out who was going to write what, Manfred wanted to write the essay on what is global studies. All right, fine, Manfred, you have some good ideas. And Saskia wanted to write about the kind of a localization and globalization and the tension between the two, which is, of course, very interesting and very productive. And that left me to write the essay on the evolution of the field, which I did in part because I've been in contact with people since the field emerged in the mid-90s. We were the first one anywhere in a research university anywhere in the world. Not that other departments or programs of global studies were based on us, but there now have been an extraordinary proliferation of global studies programs throughout the world, both undergraduate and notably graduate programs in over 80 universities throughout the world, which is a remarkable thing. Again, we can't take credit for it. We just happen to be one of the earliest in a research university. And having said programs and departments, I also want to cast the net a little wider, include all the people who do global studies, which is an enormous number. And indeed, that's kind of the first aspect, the first subject of the first tension that I want to mention, and that is the tension between the multidisciplinary nature of global studies and global studies as a separate field. So since from the very beginning, Giles, as you remember, when we had the opportunity to start a program in global studies, we discovered that we could actually switch FTE into the program. Santa Barbara, unlike Berkeley, where I had began my career, was terribly dominated by the fiefdoms of departments. UC Santa Barbara allows interdisciplinary programs to be the receptor of FTE teaching positions, which is wonderful. That meant that we could move part of our position into global studies, but only part. Rich Applebaum stayed half in sociology, where he had previously been a department chair. Giles stayed half in English, where he had previously been a department chair. And I stayed also happily half in sociology. I said happily because, I hadn't been in a department of sociology before I came to Santa Barbara, and I was just delighted at discovering a new field and being a part of it. So all three of us wanted to continue the globalization of our own fields, because by this time in the mid-90s, scholars throughout the curriculum were understanding the importance of globalization, and still are. And some of the most important work, of course, in global studies, is done by scholars who are not in global studies in the narrow sense of a department or a program. My two co-editors for the Oxford Handbook of Global Studies, Manfred Steger, although he started a wonderful program in Melbourne, Australia, we then moved to Hawaii. He's not in a department of global studies currently. Saskia Sassen is in sociology at Columbia, not in the department or program of global studies, even though her work is so significant for the field of global studies. So it started very much as a multidisciplinary program, and we assumed that when new people would come in, they would keep their connections with their old departments. In fact, we were desperately looking for faculty to help teach the courses. So we got Su-Chen Chan from history, for example, to co-teach the course with Giles. You remember that, Giles, that you and she were teaching Global One together.
Great team.
And then actually I took over and taught it with her 1 year, and it almost ruined her marriage. She preferred teaching with you, I'm afraid. I would make up stories, and Giles is much more straightforward. But Su-Chen from history, and brought a whole history component from the very beginning. Jerry Cohen from political science was very much involved in all of the early discussions. Richard Hecht from religion, and Madison Mines from anthropology. So it was originally conceived as a multicultural program. And then only in time, as we got new positions and we had courses to teach and a larger student demand, we needed those courses, we needed those faculty. Increasingly, the faculty became solely global studies, but with an expectation that they be connected with affiliated with some disciplinary department, in part because, at least initially, we didn't have a PhD program. And so to keep that kind of PhD connection, it was important for people to keep in touch with their own discipline. Now that's changed in time, in part because global studies now does have a PhD program. And part of creating the logic of that program, as you know well, Giles, because you were playing the leading role in it, was to make the argument that the global studies was a separate field. It had separate methodologies and disciplines and, and approaches that were appropriate to its field. And since then, Jan has taken a leading role in helping to think in terms of transdisciplinary research and to think beyond the disciplines. And that, of course, is an important component. So there continues to be this tension between the transdisciplinary, solo, global studies focused research and teaching, and the multidisciplinary character out of which was part of its origins. That is sometimes, you know, we have all these affiliates associated with global studies. We were talking about this just now in our department meeting, that we seldom call upon or involved within the Department of Global Studies. And I think that's a mistake. I think part of the mission is to reach out, to engage faculty from throughout the curricula. Of course, the Orfalea Center does that to some extent, and that's one of the reasons why the Orfalea Center was set up. So it would help to nurture global studies across the curricula. And yet I think the department has that task as well, and that mission is a part of its obligation, and it will be enriched because of it. That brings me to the second tension, and that is between kind of the nature of the curriculum. What is it that we're teaching and what is it that we expect students to do? Well, from the very first discussions about a program in global studies, when a famous encounter where Rich grabbed me in the hall of Ellison Hall and said, "Hey, you were a dean of international studies at the University of Hawaii, right? You helped to create a new school." I said, "Yeah, that's right." He says, "We want to do the same thing at Santa Barbara." I said, "Oh, really?" "Yes." and what he had in mind, and I quickly resonated with, was something like the schools of international affairs at Woodrow Wilson, the school at Princeton that Rich had been a part of. And Jerry Cohen, who was one of the early people involved in these discussions, had been in the Fletcher School at Tufts. And I had had a part of my graduate career was at the Columbia School of International Affairs. So all of us were familiar with these 2-year MA program training that were meant to be for practical purposes, training students to go out in the world to do things. Most of the international affairs programs were training people for diplomacy or for international finance, but increasingly for NGO leadership. And we thought that was a niche that we could pick up on at Santa Barbara. And when we proposed that initially, the university was not wild about it. Richard tells a story about Barbara Boudin. No, not Boudin. What's our previous chancellor's name? He'll tell you that story.
Barbara Euling.
Yeah.
Right.
How she thought it didn't have a sizzle. But then Henry Yang was a bit more receptive, but he put us in with the group trying to plan for a business school. So for a whole year, we were suffering in these mutual discussions until at the end, we concluded with what most of us realized at the beginning. We really had nothing in common. We couldn't possibly have a single school that was both business and global studies. It was not our vision of what a global studies was or the kind of students we wanted to train. But the MA program was initially thought to be the heart of what we were trying to do. And the initial, when we did get money from Paul Orfalea and enabled us to create an MA program, the proposal we drafted was for a school of global studies. And the school was like these schools of international studies that have this MA program at the heart, but involve faculty from all over in a kind of affiliate part-time way. That was the model at Columbia that I was familiar with when I was a graduate student there. But the focus would be on real world issues and training people for real world careers, or a problem-focused kind of curriculum. Well, that didn't work out for a number of reasons. Probably the most important of it was the lack of administrative will. I think because the chancellor and the vice chancellor had endured the pains of creating the Bren School for Environmental Studies, a lot of departments were furious at that, thinking that resources had been taken from them. They weren't ready to go through that again. So there was no administrative support for it. So I quickly rewrote the proposal so that the money we had in the proposal for the dean of the school, which was a programmatic fund, now became the basis of a separate center, the Orfalea Center, that then could reach across the curriculum and provide a support for global studies across the curriculum, whereas the rest of the funds and the concept of the program would be within a program and ultimately a department that would focus on its own students and its own career. So that's how all that started. It also explains some of the peculiarities, why there was no infrastructure set up in the budget for the Orfalea Center. Omar is wondering. It's because that was supposed to be administered, it was all supposed to be a part of the same program initially, but it didn't turn out to be the case. So the program turned really in a different direction. I'm not saying it's a bad direction. In some ways, it's been delightful, but it's different. And it's created it's created a new kind of tension, and that is between the academic focus of the program versus the practical focus. Now, to be straightforward, from the very beginning, we had to confront this, even with the MA program. One of the issues was, are we going to call it a Master's of International Affairs or a Master's of Global Studies or an MA in Global Studies? That is, are we going to give it a professionally designated career name, the way in which the international school at San Diego did with its degree in International and Pacific Studies, or were we going to call, or is this going to be an academic program with an emphasis on global studies? And we agreed that it should be an academic program, that we're not ready to give up that that connection or that vision. So from the very beginning, it was conceived as an academic program that would be useful for students going into into NGO kinds of work and other kinds of work. And we assumed that some of the students would go on to get a PhD someplace and are going to law or some other kind of field. So from the very beginning, this tension was a part of the conceptualization, even when we thought it was going to be a part of the school. And increasingly, that's been the case, especially after we've created our own PhD program. Now, a PhD program was a good idea because we couldn't have been a department without it. And there are other PhD programs beginning to emerge around the world in global studies. And we certainly didn't want to be left out. After all, Santa Barbara had helped to create the field. We wanted to be a part of that idea that you could become proficient on a PhD level in global studies. And it turned out to be quite wonderful in many ways. And with graduate student cohorts who are able to think in terms of their intellectual interests and their research, just as I must say, all of us did, why we were interested in global studies in the first place. Giles has had a background in global literature. Rich has been interested in global labor practices. My interest in religious nationalism was due, as a global phenomenon, was due to the discovery that in many ways it was response to the perceived failures of nationalism and the nation state in an era of globalization that gave rise to new forms of religious nationalism. And by the way, which still does, even today, we see it in our own American politics. So all of us had a research agenda that was appropriate for graduate level training. So it's not as if it was inappropriate. And yet that original vision was still there and still is. And so that tension still remains. And to this day, I think that a lot has been lost in the MA program not being as central to the heart of the global studies program department now as it once was. I mean, originally, it was conceived to be 20 students a year, a kind of small for international affairs programs, niche program of some 40 students. That hasn't happened. And the kind of vision of training students for an NGO is one that's still there, but that in my mind, I think that's certainly something that needs to be developed. And the third tension, and these are all to some extent, has to do with the role of global studies within the university. And this is true of individuals who think globally and work on individual research, as well as us as a field. And that is how they think of what they're doing in relationship to the rest of the curriculum of the university. You know, I'm called upon from time to time to review other programs in global studies around the country. I've done at least a dozen of these in the last. And I remember once in North Carolina, the faculty saying, you know, the university is so proud that global studies is central to the curriculum, and they wanted to develop global studies because they thought it was so central. And they told me, he said, we don't believe that. We don't think we should be central. We think we should be at the periphery. We think we should be critical outsiders rather than patsies that just came into the intellectual and political status quo. And I understand their point, and I think we understand that those of us who are part of global studies from inside, the degree to which we are part of the mainstream of the curriculum, or whether our role is to be critical outsiders. And this comes up especially when we think about globalization as a phenomenon that is primarily spearheaded from the developed countries, and globalization from the South. And I'm proud that our department has tried to make sure that, certainly in its hiring and its intellectual concerns, to make sure that the Global South is a part of our continuing awareness, and then allow for those voices to come in a critical way, as well as just falling in line with whatever we think is the received knowledge for the field. That's, of course, what keeps it fresh for the future, and not just from geographically different perspectives, but to have a strong feminist component, to have a queer component that helps to keep us alert to the different ways in which a dominant socialization, whether it's in nation states or globally, are challenged from different perspectives and from different voices. So these are three tensions that I think have been a part of the field of global studies, both among individual scholars and certainly within programs and departments such as ours. And you may say, well, now which side are you on in each one of these? And the answer is both of them, really. I mean, I see these as creative tensions. I think the very fact that we have this tension, or this kind of sliding scale of degrees of difference characterized by these three tensions, is really a good thing. It's what keeps departments vibrant and active. I'd be afraid if any of these swung too far one direction or the other, because I think the tension itself is what keeps the field fresh and alive. And I, along with Giles and Rich, am so privileged to have been a part of it at the beginning, and so proud to see the way it's developed. So I want to thank you for listening to my comments now, and I hope I've given ample time, first of all, for my colleagues, Rich and Giles, to comment, and then to open the floor to all of you. I see so many of you who have so many interesting things to say. Peter Hasland has joined us, Shendu, Vishnu, Anshu, Allison, Barry, Jan, of course, and his conceptualization. So I hope we have time for everybody. But Giles and Rich, correct me where I've gone wrong and set the record straight.
Well, Mark,
Rich, have a go.
everything you said is completely wrong, and I'm here to set the record straight. Actually, Giles' introduction of you was, I thought, so appropriate for the Easter holiday. I thought you have risen. I mean, you're about to become canonized. So I just want to say a few additional words. I think tension is great, and Mark has identified these tensions, I think, quite well. First I want to go back a year before Mark came here and tell you where the idea of global studies originated. So Matt Mines, who Mark mentioned, was chairing an academic senate committee, which was charged with internationalizing the campus. UC Santa Barbara, for reasons which I will never understand, was designated the international campus of the UC system in the master plan by Clark Kerr some years before, maybe because we're in the middle of nowhere in Santa Barbara, so we could only be international rather than cosmopolitan. So in any event, I was invited to join Mine's committee. I was, I think at the time, an assistant professor still. But I had sort of gotten the globalization bug. I'd been to Asia to study factories. I could see where the dynamism was and was definitely outside the US borders. And so I pushed the Minds Committee to call for a School of Global Studies. I won't go into the details, but there were many, many iterations of that Mark, Giles, and I were a part of to create a School of Global Studies, which ultimately created what you see here. At that time, Tony Giddens, who's going to be giving a colloquium, I guess in a couple of weeks, was visiting the sociology department. I might have been chair of sociology at that time, I can't recall. And so Tony and I went to see Barbara Ewing, who is the chancellor, to propose that she endorse the Academic Senate's committee recommendation that a School of Global Studies be created. And this where she said, globalization, the idea lacks sizzle. And I remember Tony Giddens, who is not known for his patience, kind of tapped his fingers on the desk, and I created a very tense moment there. I will add one other thing to what Mark said about the creation of the school, or the non-creation of this, so the creation of the program in global studies. It happened because Mark was able to schmooze Paul Orfalea into giving a gift of $10 million if the master's program was created. And I will say, well, this is being recorded, but whatever. I don't think it would have happened. Let me put it this way. Whether the notion of global studies had intellectual merit in the eyes of the higher ups in the university is questionable. But once it came with the $10 million gift tag, it suddenly had merit. And Mark, you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think Paul Orfalea, who is the founder of Kinko's, which had just been sold to Federal Express for a few $1 billion, so Paul had quite a bit of pocket change. I think he gave us until April 1st, April Fool's Day, to have it confirmed up in the office of the president. Anyhow, all the committees then lined up and thought that this was the greatest idea they'd ever heard for a master's program. So I just want to say a couple of other things apart from that. The idea of the master's program was really to be an activist program involving a 6-month overseas internship, which would be funded by the Orfalea money. And we are all sort of stoked on the role of civil society, NGOs, neither governments nor business, but some third sector to make a difference in the world. And that was the location of the master's program. And in the tension with the doctoral program, I always worried that that would be lost. One other thing to add is that, and now Mark and I differ in our recollection of this, but my memory is correct. We called ourselves Global and International Studies, MAGIS, and it wasn't just so we could call our students the Magi to reflect Mark's religious orientation. It was because, at least in my view, the world at this moment, and this is still the case, is engaged in a tension between two great tectonic shifts, globalization and geopolitics and international relations. And the jury is out on that. So I never saw us as an exclusively global studies program looking at the processes of globalization, developing a unique discipline around it, unique methodology and all of that. I wasn't particularly troubled by the interdisciplinarity of it. I thought created a kind of rich stew to team teach courses and so forth. What really engaged me was, how does globalization play out in a world which, over the last couple hundred years has emerged as a world of competing nation states? And my own research on China, which clearly was arising as a hegemonic power, challenged the notion of globalization. And so there are just a lot of issues there. which I didn't want to be lost. Now, Mark, as I recalls we added international to somehow draw on political science and make them feel like they were kindred spirits. Political science has never been too fond of global studies. Jerry Cohen was sort of the lone voice there, I think, that joined us. So that's another tension which I would like to introduce to this discussion, because it does seem to me that globalization may have reached its turning point, at least for the moment. We're seeing a resurgence of nationalism, of international relations, of geopolitical struggles, of hegemonic struggles. And on the left, Walden Bellow, the idea of deglobalization, that we should begin to bring jobs and natural and farming and all of that home. The whole issue of global supply chains and what they contribute to the carbon footprint, or what they contribute to labor abuses, which is my research. All of these things are sort of on the table for discussion now. So I would hope that wouldn't be lost. So let me just say one other thing, then I'll turn it over to Giles. Is global studies its own field of studies? Jan has really addressed this directly in his writings a lot, and I'm sure he'll have something to say about this, but it's never been clear to me at all that it is. Is there a unique method which is global, apart from trying to take into account what is happening transnationally and not being caught up in one's own mindset? The fact that there are many sources of globalization besides the Western canonical source of globalization, something that Barry has addressed and that we've addressed in this colloquium series. So it's not clear to me that there is a unique methodology. To me, what global studies is about is the study of the process of globalization through whatever lens can be used in that. And it doesn't bother me. I thought it was a strength that our department was cobbled together from many different disciplines, ranging from the humanities, what Giles does, to what Mark does, what I do, what the faculty do, which depart from different methodologies, different premises, and different concerns, but always with the concern about the effect of globalization on our lives. So I will leave it there, and Giles, I'll pass the baton to you, and then maybe the three of us can shut up and hear from others.
Well, I really don't want to say very much because I want to bring others in immediately. I'll only make one or two comments, and they're really just that. What both narratives have reinforced is how much the history, at least of our development of this program, in all of its facets, in all of its multiple directions and many confusions, reveals is that we are in fact a product of a variety of very concrete circumstances. From the fact that when we began, the university was trying to work its way through a $1 billion deficit, merely a local matter, but of great consequence, to the fact that we, of course, couldn't hire whom we wanted, even if we had been able to figure out who that should be or what. We had to work with what we had. And even the fields that we developed were developed on the basis of what kind of strength, if we all pushed our limits past where we could see that their ending, we could go. So a lot of our history, I think, is local. And that is important to say, because the issue would be how well did we do with the stuff we had to work with? And I would say we did extraordinarily well. As somebody who had been teaching most of my careers as a Chicago, Chapel Hill, and here, we had done better than I'd seen it done anywhere, as a matter of fact, given our resources. And I continue to think that's true. And of course, the new hires that we have made have again worked on newer concerns that have come to the fore and newer ways of connecting already proven resources and so on. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is only this. One of the great struggles has been a kind of working out of the relationship between our PhD program and our MA program. From my point of view, we would not have in fact survived even with the Orfalea money very well, at least in university politics, if we didn't bring this toward, if not into, a PhD structure. At our university, that's how you became fully negotiable, or at least that's how I saw it and how most of the people that I talked with in the administration felt. And I still think that's true. In any case, a lot of what the distinctions, proper and appropriate, that we had to deal with between an MA program and a PhD program got hung up on, as opposed to always exploiting well, was the sort of difference between academic and practical, which I always thought was bogus. And I always thought it was bogus because, as anybody who knows me and my work, I'm a pretty, not rigid, but committed pragmatist. And there's John Dewey's great statement about the fact that what we're interested in doing in academic life, it seems to me, as well as perhaps in many other parts of it as well, is not so much trying to make intelligence practical as making practice intelligent, which means bringing to bear the practical implications of any decisions we make against the conceptual possibilities we have for rethinking them. And we struggled with that. I think some of that has gone into some very good writing on the part of a number of us. But I think that can be a false dichotomy. I have no doubt in my mind, and I've worked with a hell of a lot of students at the graduate level all my life, that some of our MA students are the best people I've ever worked with in my career, hands down. They could sort of do anything, and they may now be running companies that invest in issues and are making a hell of a lot of money, or they may be doing all kinds of other things. But it was a pleasure and a privilege to work with them. At the same time, I think some of our PhD students have wonderfully concrete minds, saturated with different sorts of actualities that have to be taken account of before we can entertain certain kinds of conceptualizations. So that's both our strength. It's also something that we have to work at better. And I have no idea what's been going on for the last 3 years, but I'm sure it's an improvement from when I retired. Let me open it up to everybody else. How should we do this? Why don't you just indicate if you have something to say? And if there's a confusion, I'll try to point to one who had the priority, if I can figure that out, and we'll go from there. Anyone?
I'm eager to hear Giles, Jan's take on this.
I was about to say, maybe that we should turn to Jan. Jan, you're muted. You're still muted.
Well,
There you go.
Mark, Giles, Rich, what a wonderful opening of the cycle and a good overview. I would add 1 or 2 points. One, let us widen the database of global studies in that we are aware that now everybody in the world does global studies. The global studies constituency consists of billions of people who, in the light of COVID, must reposition themselves, and everybody does comparative studies as to whether it is safe, the degree of safety. Second, global studies, actually, I think if we go beyond the university also in this sense, is primarily done in risk analysis on the part of major agency, risk analysis in terms of security, corporations, finance, climate change. And with these global studies, there are billions on the table, trillions of dollars on the table. So this is very serious work. And it is, I suppose, in many ways, much more serious than what is happening in the universities. And they face many different tensions. Talking about three tensions. I'm thinking of the tensions of the panorama, the overview, the wide shot and the detail, the macro and the micro, the tension between the tension of paradigm quagmires. No matter the technical sophistication you put in action, the paradigms you use limit your horizon, put you into tunnels and rabbit holes. And the third tension I think that everybody faces is the tension of what are your interests that define your approach. So I think, Mark, these are marvelous overviews, but let us widen it beyond the universities and take into account that global studies is happening now on a planetary scale with a multi-billion participation.
So Peter Hasland has his hand up.
Yeah,
Okay.
Peter created the Global Studies program at Santa Barbara Community College at the same time we were creating our program at UC Santa Barbara. So he's been part of our extended family from the very beginning.
Right, and became a feeder into our program, and they were coordinated. And I don't know about you, Mark or Giles, but I often gave lectures in Peter's program.
You did indeed, and I want to. Well, so did Mark, and I can't remember whether Giles ever had.
I did once.
And I've so much valued my relationship with the three of you over such a long period of time in the process of developing this truly interdisciplinary approach to a look at globalization, which I think is probably the only way it could truly be done effectively. And I had the privilege of actually teaching one section of global studies at UCSB. Most of my teaching was at City College. Just as a very brief segue to an introduction, it was in the very early 1980s that I had applied for a sabbatical leave for the purpose of creating a global and international studies program. I think I called it international studies at first. And the chair of the sabbatical leave committee came to my office and said, I just don't think that that should work. I just don't think that a community college should have a global studies program. And he couldn't quite explain why. But somehow I managed to convince the committee to give me that leave anyway. And we did. And the purpose was, at least my purpose was, to ensure that American students had at least a small chance at viewing themselves not at the center of the world or the center of the universe, but as part of a global structure. And globalization was happening, no matter what Jerry Cohen said. He was suggesting that it might end at some future point, and maybe now as he would join in and say, yeah, it did end. But it was primarily for the same reason that I took students to China for many, many years, 1985 forward. I wanted them to see themselves as part of the world as opposed to distinct from it or at the center of the universe, which I think is a plausible lesson that's well worth sharing.
Thank you. Others, please don't hold back.
Giles, can I just respond to what Peter said and offer
Sure.
one additional thought? I totally share what you just said, Peter. American students, UC Santa Barbara students, naturally tend to be insular. And I always thought that part of our mission was to open their eyes. So I'll say a couple of things about that. One is that our major grew from 0 to probably 800 or 900 students within a few years. And one of the purposes of the major and the large classes that we taught, that Mark, Giles, and I taught, was to open students' eyes to what was happening in the world. Around the time that I retired a number of years ago, our global studies program at UCSB sent more students to the University of California study abroad program than any other unit in the entire University of California system. We actively push students to get out of the US and to open their eyes. The other thing I want to say is this, and this may be provocative, and this goes to what Giles had said about knowledge being practical and practice being knowledgeable. I can't remember quite the coupling that you used.
About intelligence.
So we all share that idea of the scholar practitioner, the person who is grounded as an academic, as a scholar, but who can use that knowledge in the service of something. And maybe because of when I came of age in the 60s and early 70s, I always sort of hearkened to Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, you know, the old adage, philosophers have always interpreted the world. The point is to change it. I always thought that one of the missions of the master's program, certainly, which is why I put so much energy into creating it, was create a cadre of students that wouldn't be trained at Harvard or Yale or Columbia or Princeton to go out and become part of government or business or the ruling class, however you want to look at it, but would be troublemakers and work for civil society, for progressive organizations, for unions, for groups that were concerned with issues of social justice. So at least in my own personal thinking, there is always a strong normative aspect. And we, you know, had faculty in our program who reflected that. When Richard Falk and Halal Alva were part of our faculty, you know, that came to the fore also. And I think that's been reflected in all of our teaching in the program also. And that's another thing I would hope wouldn't be lost.
Just to add to that, when we started the Global Studies Consortium that now has some 80 universities around the world, we were compiling what we thought were the basic tenets of global studies, including, you know, the concern about transnationalism and the global issues, the problem-focused, multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. But I added very consciously that we were trying to train global citizens. We were trying, that was one of the parts of our mission. And I felt that very strongly and have in all of my teaching, the feeling, the responsibility to try to open the eyes of California undergraduates, but increasingly, of course, students from all over the world, but to think more globally and to think of themselves as global citizens. My colleague at Leipzig, Matthias Medell, strongly objected to this. He is a historian at background, and he said that the job of scholarship, of academia, is to critique the world, not to train people for some kind of posture within it. Yes, that may be an inadvertent result of global studies, but that shouldn't be part of our mission. I still disagree. And to my mind, I still think that one of the great virtues of a program like this is that it tries to prepare people for leadership in a global world, and we hope in a positive way.
Right,
Let me invite others of you who not just haven't yet spoken, but who have different experiences of this in Santa Barbara or elsewhere to join in.
Yeah, Bishnu, your hand is up.
We have several hands up.
I can't see them.
Well, thank you all for this incredible conversation. It's very instructive actually to hear about where it started and the struggles you faced, because I think they leave their traces in things that we encounter even now with the, you know, a much larger and changing department. My question is how you've negotiated your relationship to your disciplines, or what might have been an original disciplinary base. And I say this for two reasons. One, I think most of us who came into global studies were really already interdisciplinary minded, and we felt our own disciplines were too limiting. And I find my work is enormously enriched by my colleagues and students here. However, when it comes to training graduate students, and so many of our graduate students are here, sometimes they'll say, well, I'm going to do a cultural analysis of this, and I find that we haven't taught the method, or we haven't, they don't have a training in ethnography. So sometimes I run up constantly against the disciplinary, and which makes me think about what my own interdisciplinarity is doing. So I know it's a complicated question. I don't have an answer for it, but I feel like I have commitments to different communities in my discipline as well. So I've wondered how you have negotiated that.
I can speak quickly to it. You made reference earlier to the distinction between global studies and political science. At City College, I chaired the political science department, and therefore global studies became a reality.
So it became part of your mission in global studies.
No. Oh yeah. We didn't have, there's something else went on at UCSB that I never quite understood, but it didn't happen at City College.
Vishnu, I can
Others,
answer.
I'm missing hands, Brett. I see where the hands are. They're all over the place. How can I do this in order?
Giles, do you want to respond to Vishnu's question? In my case, I think I neglected my connection with sociology quite a bit, but I've been trying to revive it more recent years. But Giles, you have stayed more active in the English department, I think.
Well, I'm not sure I did that, but in my last book, I went back, so to speak, to rewrite the history of American literature from the point of view of certain perspectives that I acquired and had been employing in a bunch of books about global ethics and cosmopolitanism and so on in my work in global studies for 20 years. Now, I don't think that changed anything except my view of that past. But it was for me an extraordinarily exciting way to wind things up.
Yeah.
But please let me get to hands now. Tommaso?
Giles, I see Zuza from Illinois.
I see them. I see them
Abdul
now.
and Tommaso.
Yeah,
And James, pardon.
Let me start with Tommaso.
No, start with Zuza or James. They were earlier.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Sorry.
Zuza, please.
Oh, hi, I'm Juergensmeyer. Giles. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois. I'm also the director of the Global Studies undergraduate program here. So I'm deeply involved and committed to global studies. And one thing that has particularly been bugging me over the last 10, 15 years is the issue of methodology. And I noticed a certain contradiction between what Mark said and Richard said. Mark pointed out the importance of seeing things from the perspective of the global South, yet Richard said that global studies doesn't have its own methodology. But I do wonder if you think of methodology in a broader sense, that is not as simply a set of data collection methods, but as a particular epistemological frame that dictates how we connect data to theory and vice versa. If there is something distinctive, I'm particularly curious how you teach certain decolonial, post-colonial research perspectives in your, especially at the graduate level. I mean, in my mind, at least 4 key classical social science fallacies have to be acknowledged that to this day guide how social science research is done, even when it is about matters of global and transnational. One is the methodological nationalism fallacy. The second is the idea that we can still do cross-national comparison when in fact we can no longer assume the independence of the units that we compare. Then there's the assumption of the scalar hierarchy of the local, national, global that Saskia Sasson has written about, but also the assumption that when we study at the local level, all we can come up with are particular concrete findings. And if you want to theorize, you still have to perch yourself at the scale of the macro, but preferably at the global. So I was really curious what methodological training you provide, how you navigate these kinds of old classical methodological challenges. Thank you. I'm sorry I spoke for so long.
Very interesting question. Who would like to
Giles,
answer
how
that?
do you want us to try to, how do you want to man? I mean, I can give you an answer, but we want to hear from other people. So how should we manage this?
Well, who would like to say, either amplify it, challenge it,
Maybe
put a question to Mark, or
Giles,
to
maybe
others here,
you could
who
have a couple.
obviously thought deeply about these things, like Barry Axford.
Maybe we could
I just don't want the three of us to.
No, I quite agree.
Well, that's why maybe it'd be good to have a couple more questions and comments on the floor, and then we can comment. We can have more general discussion.
Okay, so there is the question. That question of.
I'll come back to your question at some point.
All right, but then let me turn to next Abdul, I beg your pardon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abdul Gaffar. I am a PhD student at the Department of International Relations, University of Peshawar, Pakistan. And I'm working here with Jan. Actually, my question is related to the theory and methodology also. Most of you has talked about it, but as I see, other than globalization, I don't see any theory developed by the discipline of global studies. Second, as far as the scope and area of research is concerned, so is this possible for the students of global studies to conduct a systematic, scientific, and empirical research work in global studies? Because being a student of international relations, I have faced many problems if you are working on a topic or a project which is related to many areas, and especially if the issue involves many countries. So it is very difficult for students to conduct empirical research due to difficulty of fieldwork. So don't you see that global studies will also face the same problem of conducting scientific research in the field?
And that's directed to anybody, or?
Oh, well, it's directed to Richard. Richard has talked about all the things that were on my mind. First of all,
Can we hear from Tommaso first, then come back to all three of these?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Tommaso. Nice to see you, Mark, and all of you. My experience, I moved from Italy to Australia, and then from the field of study of art history and theory to that one of visual culture, these days global media stuff. What struck me, what made me to move from one nationalistic methodological field to a more theoretical, global, and methodological understanding of the world in which we live was really this possibility to approach the world through a global frame and to overcome the tearing debate even of the past. I remember on globalization journals between Mark, Jan, Manfred, and many others of you, between the academic, administrative, and semantic ideological definition of globalization study versus global study. I think we can do this by introducing the ideological frame of globalization, which help us to overcome this conflicting debate between the local and the global, and to better understand globalization as both material and ideational process. This is just my experience.
Rich, do you want to
Sure.
answer that?
So let me respond. I think this might encompass all three of your comments by first saying that the answer has to be within the context of specific research, not broadly. So let me talk about my own research, which has to do with workers' rights, labor issues, things of that sort. So when I was at Princeton University, the theory of the time was modernization theory. And those of you who know anything about that know that, that basically argued that countries were poor because of their own failings, fatalistic culture, all that kind of stuff. And this sort of informed American policy at the time also. And my eyes were sort of opened when I began to look at critiques of that from the global south, dependency theory, dependent development theory, world systems theory. So when it came to studying workers, how do you do that? Well, you look at the globalization of production, you look at global supply chains, you see how they play out. Instead of, you look at ideas of core and peripheral relations between countries. And then how do you study that? Well, my own research was based on field work. Getting myself into factories, talking to workers in different countries, getting involved with unions and things like that. Basically that type of, quote, qualitative research, although there's plenty of quantitative data also that we've drawn on. Ashish, who's on this call, supervised a number of our students looking at wages in apparel exporting countries, study that was eventually published by the Worker Rights Consortium, and I'm forgetting the other organization that published it. So, I think, right, so to decouple it from a nationalist approach and try to understand how these processes play out globally, and then going and doing research, whatever kind of research you can. I don't think there's any unique research methodology that has been invented to do this, beyond looking at it. There's a challenge, of course, because the trade statistics are compiled nationally, and it's hard to uncouple how the global economy works today, which is not nationally based. I mean, that's a fiction now.
Mark, will you handle this for a minute?
So you make do with what you can. It would be, I could say more than that, but I try to approach it from whatever it is you're looking at. Mark goes to refugee camps and talks to refugees fleeing religious violence. I'll end there. I mean, I don't want to give my. Oh, let me just say one other thing. So when I taught courses in global studies on this topic, looking at the global economics and so on, I would take students through the kind of history of how this was looked at from a time when it really privileged the sort of US Western-centric approach to bringing in voices from the global South, and sort of to deconstruct that kind of understanding and to get them to see things differently, and also to get students to relocate themselves elsewhere in other parts of the world to experience it.
I've got three more hands. I think it's this order: Daniel, and then Felicia, and then Allison.
Giles, could I just add a comment to what Richard said on methodology, agreeing that there is no one methodology, or we shouldn't even be striving for some sort of central methodology for the field of global studies, but it should be appropriate to what people are working on and the kind of research interests they have. But I do want to add that there are novel techniques or approaches that develop out of this. And I'll offer my own work as an example. A couple of years ago, a scholar from Copenhagen, from Denmark, came to work with me at Orfalea Center, and we worked on the issue of methodology. And what we discovered that what we had in common, she studied the Pakistan Taliban, Mona Sheikh, a wonderful scholar. And so we developed what we thought was an understanding of how we went about our work, kind of backwards after we did it. And that was the concept of worldview analysis, that what we were trying to do was to understand how the worldviews of people are created and are shattered and come into conflict with one another. And it made a huge impact, I think, on the way we think in policy terms about the way we deal with particularly violent religious groups in other parts of the world. We have to get inside their minds. We have to get inside their mindset to understand their worldview in order to understand how that can be transformed in some way or made into a more non-violent world. So the idea of worldview analysis that we've developed is now turned into a book called Entering Religious Minds. You can buy it at better bookstores everywhere. Routledge is actually sold it at a very reasonable price, which is good for Routledge. It's the social study of worldviews is its subtitle, an attempt to try to, in some ways, develop a method within the field of global studies that's appropriate, at least to the kind of work that we do.
Okay, let me get back then, starting with Daniel, and did I have the order right then? Felicia and then Allison? Daniel, please.
You're on
We can't hear you.
Daniel. You're on mute. Daniel, you're on mute.
Thanks. Okay, so after buying in fully into the master's program of global studies, I went on to pursue my PhD, right? And what I came to learn very quickly is that the schools of disciplinary thought, be it political science, sociology, or whatever, are so strong that it was very difficult for me to engage with them with this more reflexive global studies thinking mode. And my move then was to go into global history just because, at least in Germany, there was a much higher responsiveness to thoughts of post-colonial theory, of decentralizing European history, bringing in perspectives from China. It is very obviously that we need these perspectives in order to understand the world today as it unfolds. And my question to you, maybe Rick or also Mark, would be, how do you see the relationship between global studies and global history? Like, I guess probably the global studies you had in mind when you founded the department was not so much about historicizing globalization, but more this practical engagement, as I understand it. But now it's very obvious that the two are somehow completely interrelated and share ideas. But where are maybe limits, but where are agreements in between the two fields? That would be my question.
Let me just say from the very beginning, it's actually Jerry Cohen, the political scientist, who insisted that we have a history component. He said you can't understand contemporary globalization without understanding the past, which is interesting. You'd think a political science political scientist would not have that perspective, but he did. And of course, as I mentioned, Suchen Chan, a historian, was a part of our original team. And when we did finally get money to hire a position, the very first position that we hired was in global history. And we wanted to have somebody who specifically was in global history, not world history that dealt with the different traditions sort of side by side in a comparative sense. Somebody who really understood the globalization of culture and wanted and studied history from that perspective. And that person that we hired was Dominic Saxemeyer, who became, of course, your advisor, Daniel, when you were in Germany, because he didn't stay with us forever. He then left and went to Duke for a while in history, and then finally went back to Germany, first at Bremen and now at Göttingen, where he's become quite a star in the field of global history. And his works in global history, I think, are really quite promising. But I think it's good to remember that he started off with us and that we started off with him. And so for years, of course, Jan has always had a interest in global history. So have I, so many of us. But now we have Anshu Malhotra, who brings the whole field of history into the department, which I think is a wonderful addition and will enrich the conversation for all of us.
Alicia.
Hi. Hi, everybody. My name is Felicia. I was also a student in the Magis program in the 7th cohort with Daniel Palm, actually. And so I completed my master's and I went on to teach global studies at a high school level, which was a whole experience. And I spoke about that at a certain point a couple of years ago. And now I'm in a doctoral program at UCLA in education and social science comparative education. And I just thought it would be relevant to hear the students' perspective. I think it's really intriguing that as I'm developing my research and feeling out the field of education, because I don't actually have a formal training in education, though I've been in education for more than a decade now, because the question of methodology is ever persistent. I mean, I think that I had a lot of trouble when I was pursuing my doctoral program. It was very difficult for me to find a program that could house my idea of the methodology that I gleaned from global studies. And thinking back to it now that I'm in this doctoral program in social science comparative education, and what I'm looking at is global citizenship education itself. This is probably a critique of the master's program. When I was there, we really didn't have a robust training in methodology. And it worked to a point, but it's one of the areas that I'm very curious about to hear and see and probably research myself, how it develops. My sense from, as I've done my research and I've conducting my own research, is that global studies, it would be impossible to have a formal methodology for the field of global studies. I think that it, as Dr. Applebaum said, as Rich said, it truly depends on the nature of your research. But to that point, there's a global element, I think, that is really persistently visible, whether if you're looking at something very micro and doing interviews and research of a qualitative nature, that global element still comes out. In my research, when I'm speaking with students about their ideas of global citizenship education, it is impossible to disentangle their local experience and identity with their perception of the global. So in some ways, I think that it's really impossible to do this. And at the same time, we have to then deal with the macro causes. And I think, Daniel, to your point, the great contribution of global history to global studies is that it shows us the ways that culture and power systems have been connected in history and then continue to be in our present time. And that's one of the other elements of my research that actually brought me back to Jan and these conversations. So I don't have a question, but I thought it would be useful to hear from student perspective.
Very interesting. Let me go to Allison and then to Ashish and back to Daniel.
Great. Well, it's so heartwarming to see, Giles and Mark and Rich all back together and revisit the history and the trajectory. So I wanted to weigh in a little bit on some of the trajectory, speaking as someone who came 10 years ago, kind of the next generation and the next wave, and now we have several more generations gathered round. Someone who's been chair twice, and also someone who came out of political science with always have managed blessedly to find a sort of heterodox political science international wing, but always mixing in sociology, and I follow anthropology and law and society kind of trends. So first of all, I wanted to say that the mandate and the mission has really changed and expanded beyond global consciousness raising for American California students. First of all, something like 40% of our students now are first generation students. Many of them come from diasporic and transnational backgrounds. We have about something around 20% of our global studies majors now are international students. So they're international. It's a different project. About half of our graduate students are international students. And I think that has implications for the curriculum, for the theory, for the methodology. But moving on, I would say that I have taught the Global Gateway course. I've taught the Global Governance Core course. I've taught the Logics of Inquiry course and the Research Design course for the MAs. And these questions of theory and methodology, continue to come up. And I think we've kind of gone through waves of first being very patchwork, multidisciplinary, and then this kind of transdisciplinary and sometimes almost excessively anti-disciplinary. But what we end up doing most productively is assembling work like Saskia Sassen's multiscalar work. I teach, again, I come out of more political science, but I teach Arjun Appadurai's ethnoscapes concept. I look at Sally Engle-Mary's vernacularization. These are ideas that come out of specific fields and that can be applied across a wide variety of research problems, from development to human rights, to global health, to diasporic things. I would like to honor what Susa said, but go beyond it and say, on the one hand, we need to go beyond methodological nationalism, but there are times we have to return to it. There are questions, as someone pointed out, like trade statistics, where you have to be self-consciously multi-level. So global studies becomes more about the questions you ask, rather than dictating that you can only answer them in a global way. What it does rather, I think, is create an opportunity and an obligation to take a multi-level approach that is global and comparative, and sometimes international. If you're doing anything with law, if you're doing anything with health policy, as we've all been trying to these past years, you need to check in at the national level. You need some of those tools and some of those methods. But also there are issues where I think global studies has helped us to bridge from the social science side, the micro-macro divide. Because I've been looking, my recent work is on gender violence as a global phenomenon, and that is a micro-macro issue. States are sometimes involved and sometimes not. There are global institutions, there are households. So, and the kinds of tools and the kinds of disciplinary and cross-disciplinary engagements we have are relative to the issue. And that's what I teach, and that's how I try to engage our shifting population of grad students. That was very long, but I'm trying to suggest a somewhat embracing pluralistic way to take on board and take seriously the challenge of theory and method in global studies, as it's been reflected in a decade of my grappling with it in the classroom and in my own studies. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Ashish. Can't hear you, old friend.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Just to piggyback on Rich, Allison, and Felicia's answer to Susa's question. So, it was my privilege to teach methodology, or responsibility, however you look at it, in the Tower of Babel for 3 years in global. And, I want to emphasize this thing that, the multiplicity of methods is absolutely important, because without a multiplicity of methods, you can't answer a multiplicity of questions. And global studies is just huge in terms of the range of questions we have to admit and deal with. So that's one thing. Big big endorsement of many methods linked to questions. And the further point I would make is that the one risk that I kept running into in the classroom in terms of sort of thinking about student engagement and conversations breaking down across disciplinary lines actually is on the question of epistemology. Because the moment we sort of say, look, there is an epistemology and this is our epistemology, well, questions actually live downstream from epistemology. Pick an epistemology and there's a set of questions that are in and there's also a set of questions that are out. And you know, in a way that, you know, that's the big challenge you face in global studies. If you can't pick your epistemology, it's a little, you have to live with a lot more ambiguity in terms of who we are, what do we do, what do we believe in, what are our priorities. I love living with ambiguity and I look forward to doing it for many more years. I think that's kind of where we're going to be stuck. That's the compromise we've got to deal with.
Let me just say a word of thanks to everybody. I'm going to have to slip off because I have a 2 o'clock class, so I have to go off for my other class. But I hope the conversation will continue. And since I'm going off screen, you can say all the nasty things about me you want. Rich, this is your opportunity. But thank you, everybody. It's been a wonderful conversation. I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you.
Mahalo, Mark. Mahalo.
Yes. Have a good class, and it's been wonderful to think about these things. Should we go on? I'm not sure what I'm turning to our leader, Jan.
Mute.
Yeah.
We can't hear you.
The most common statement in Zoom, you're on.
James has a question. He had a question early on.
Who did?
James?
Oh yeah, it mostly got addressed, but
sorry.
Just wanted to ask a little bit of a softball question for you guys. So as someone who's probably spent more time in global studies programs than anyone, like maybe on the planet, I did my I did my BA in global studies. I left for a while, did some NGO work, came back, did my MA in global studies, left for a while, did some more NGO work, then worked in like intergovernmental organizations after that, and then have come back for the PhD program. I've sort of found that one of the like really useful tools in this program was, you know, I was always around people who sort of told me like, you know, pursue the questions, kind of Jan's last point in the chat, you know, questions first, methodology second. You know, they're saying, okay, these are your questions. And everyone would say like, okay, how do you get the answer? And for me, that's been one of the most important skills I learned out of global studies was, you know, not to have boundaries on the questions I'd ask or the methods I could use. And most of the UN work I've been doing is, you know, it involves trying to figure out what's going on in conflict zones where you have very limited access to information and things like that. And the the methods, no methods type of situation that came up in master's training ended up being so useful. But that's not really the question. The one I'm really interested in is someone who spends a lot of time in other contexts talking to other academics, and they ask, okay, so what's your PhD in? And you say global studies. And it's sometimes you get a really polite like, oh, which they obviously don't understand what you're talking about, or you get straight up, what is that? And I was wondering if any of you had advice in how, in a very, very polite, you know, type of way, you can give a 1-sentence answer to this. Thanks.
As to what is global studies?
Well, James.
I invite anyone to have at it. We've all said different things.
Giles, if I may.
Please.
I had tea 2 years ago at Westminster in the tea room of the House of Lords, and passing by came a baroness and went around and said, and what do you do? I said, global studies. And she said, good luck, mate.
I mean, so let me give a serious answer. I think there are sort of 2 ways to look at this. One is there is an answer, and I think it's pretty obvious. Global studies is the study of the global processes and so on that are reshaping the world today. And then you can go on and explain if it, you know, the methods that are used depend on the problem being asked. They come from the social sciences and history and so on. Another question is, are there jobs out there for people with PhDs in social and global studies? Because the world is still governed by the standard disciplines. So that's a whole other question, which at this late hour, we have time to address. You know, if global studies or any of the hyphenated areas, you know, Black studies, Asian American studies, whatever, if they have legs and take off over time, then maybe they become transdisciplinary disciplines themselves with cachet and so on. But right now it remains a novelty, although Mark has done heroic work, and Mark really gets credit for creating the Global Studies Consortium, and because of his entrepreneurial strengths and schmoozing skills, has really you know, helped to launch many global studies programs. So maybe as it becomes more commonplace, you know, the answer to that second question will be easier. Oh, global studies. But right now it's sort of a tough sell, I think, you know, in many places. I don't know if Giles, if you have a different take on that.
I have no informed vision about that.
But that shouldn't
But
stop.
others may very well. Please, anyone. Professor Axford, would you?
I was going to say, don't the lack of information stop you from offering an opinion. Never has stopped any of us. So
nor me, as you know. But Professor Axford.
Sure. Thank you, Giles. It's been very interesting for me to sit in on this familial discussion in many respects, because
yes,
I've always taken sustenance from the experience at UCSB in promulgating and delivering programs in global studies. Without, I think, and this is a point of approbation, without resolving the tensions that have been referred to in this in this session, and that's a strength, I think. I wrote recently that there's a tendency among students of global studies and practitioners of it, in the academic sense at any rate, to downplay achievements.
Sorry, that's me. Go ahead.
Okay, to downplay its achievements and a sort of imposter syndrome when set against the demands and styles of other disciplines. I think the study of the global, however you construe that, is bound to be messy. The most important thing we can say to master students and PhD students is that it's going to be messy. Keep an open mind. My school motto used to be keep a well-balanced mind, and I now understand what that means in relation to looking for answers to what is the global, where is it, how do you study it, what are its consequences for lived lives? Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yes.
Right, and you know, Abdul just put something in the chat, which I think is important, which sort of undermines what I said. I mean, globally, everybody knows that we live in a global world and that the problems we face today are global in nature. And so in that sense, you know, saying that I have a degree in global studies, you know, I think it may not be as, you know, it may not elicit a blank stare so much anymore. So Peter, you have your hand up.
Yes, I was simply going to try to answer the question with a bit of humility. That is, as someone who is fond of global studies, I come at it with the conviction that as a trained political scientist, I didn't have the answers. I needed somebody else in the classroom or with whatever research I was doing, somebody from economics, somebody from sociology, somebody from anthropology, somebody from history. I didn't, you know, and we taught at City College, it was truly an interdisciplinary course where at least 3 of us would be in front of the class all the time, sharing our separate disciplines' perspective on this process of globalization. So I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
I see a note from Sousa saying messy, but that doesn't mean anything goes, right? No, it doesn't mean anything goes. Rigor is always important, but I meant messy as a term of approbation.
Yes.
as implying an open mind and not to be stuck into simple dualities, rigid levels of analysis, problems and things of
Yes.
that sort. And to bring to it an inquiring mind in terms of what is the global and what are its consequences for life today.
Did you have your hand?
Thank you. It's
Amanda
2:00
has
now.
a-
Where did Jan go? There you are. Is this
Amanda
about the
has-
time to bring things to a close, or are there more people who would like to speak?
Well, there's Amanda who has a question.
I do have a question. Thanks so much for
Oh,
being
Amanda,
here.
good to see you.
Good to see you too, Professor. Can you go back a little bit to what Rich started talking, and I think James also brought it up. I'm the first cohort of PhD students at UCSB. I'm going to be hitting the job market soon. So I'm trying to develop this identity as a global studies scholar, right? How I'm going to sell myself when I get out there, and actually where I'm going to go ask for jobs, right? So I have two questions that actually bring me nightmares, and I'd love to hear from you all. One is coming from an interdisciplinary program field, what is my role in the disciplines? If I apply for a job, I do global migration. I want to call myself a migration scholar. If I apply for a job in sociology, would I pass at least the first round in the selection coming from an interdisciplinary background? The second question is about what Professor Giles called the practical intelligence, right? The global studies as theory, methodology, and also the practical side. What's the role of this practical intelligence in academia? And I think I might be asking for a job for a lot of you here. How do you perceive a PhD in global studies and this practical intelligence background, this idea that I have a hands-on experience or supposed to? I'm asking because when I'm in conferences and talking to people from disciplines, right? And when I talk about the problem solving, global studies, hands-on, I don't get good looks about that, right? I think deep inside the question, maybe my theoretical disciplinary background in a very polite way, maybe it's just me, but what's your take on that? So that's the two questions that I would really like to hear from you in this process of, placing myself as a global studies scholar. Thank you.
Would like to take a crack at that.
Just one remark, folks, and Amanda. Look, if the global problems are faced by everybody, nearly everybody on the planet constantly, then your contribution, Amanda, is where you fit in and want to make a pass, and you use all the tools and all the modes of questioning that you have access to. And that is just fine. This is a shared perplexity for 7 billion people. And we are co-navigators while all of humanity is finding its way.
Well,
And that,
I agree with that. I just want to offer a slightly different perspective. If you're looking for an academic job, the academic job market in any discipline right now is fraught. No matter what discipline you're in. So you have to do what any doctoral student does, which is good work. You have to publish. You have to. You'll be judged on your own merits, and I don't think if you do good work and if you publish it and if you get out there and are known and you give a good job talk and you have good people in the department writing letters for you, I think you have as good a chance as anybody. When people ask me what I am, of course, I'm not giving job talks these days, but I tell them I'm a recovering sociologist. I do global studies. I really think it depends on you. As much I don't think, and I agree with what Jan others have put in the chat. Oh, we live in a world now which is fraught with many global problems, and addressing those problems opens doors, but you have to do a good job doing it. And you know, whatever your research is, it's obviously going to fall under some research rubric, and you know, whether it's sociology or whatever, and all the disciplines also now are rethinking themselves anyhow in terms of post-colonial work. So don't despair. Yeah.
Well, and if I may just add, obviously, if one of your greatest interests is migrations and migration theories and the history of it and the rest of it, you're coming from a certain perspective. Of the social sciences, but that your own training and background intellectually has given you insight into those problems. Hoping that indeed, as Rich said, indeed academic disciplines are changing, and it's becoming much harder for people to define themselves according to the old categories. And I think in a program like ours, you get a lot of exposure to some of those more angular ways of coming at questions that can be of great interest to people, even if they're trained in more traditional ways. At least that's what you have to hope. And I think I'm out of it now, friends. You'll have to tell me, does that work? Anyway, this has been great fun. And I thank Jan for this. We thank Mark for this. We thank heaven for more. Lovely to see you all. Stay well.
Thanks a lot, Giles. So Brad, over to you. Let's call it off then.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. All right.